get into very specific regional changes and what they look like. We know our regions leads 2-3 AVF are inferior, V1-2 septal, V3 and 4 anterior, V5 and 6 lateral. Don't forget about lead 1 and AVL, which are also lateral, just a little higher lateral. With our anterior wall MI, this is anterior left ventricular wall MI. We're going to see this isolated to V3 and V4. We're going to see ST elevation in V3 and V4. So if you see ST elevation just in lead 3 and V4, we're going to call that an anterior wall MI, or an anterior wall STEMI. Oh, anterior wall MIs just on their own, kind of uncommon. More common, pretty common, is this anterior septal. So we're kind of squishing together this anterior wall and septal wall MI. So we have an anterior septal MI. So I'm going to see ST elevation in V1, V2, V3, V4, and somewhat common pattern. And these patients usually have some sort of cardiogenic shock, hemodynamic compromise, and it's worth noting here that we need ST elevation in contiguous leads. So I need kind of leads in order of region a little bit. So this anterior septal MI here has V1, V2, V3, and V4. But another example of an anterior septal MI might be just V2 and V3 and V4. So those are contiguous leads. They're kind of in a row. So we need our windows in a row, at least 2 windows in a row, to call a STEMI, call our MI. So here's your anterior septal MI. We have some septal involvement and we have some anterior regional involvement on our 12 lead. Then we can have a big one. We can have an anterior septal wall MI with what we're going to call lateral wall extension. So an anterior septal MI with lateral extension. That is like everything. So we've got V1, V2, ST segment elevation, V3, V4, or anterior wall, ST segment elevation. And then we're extending that to V6, V5, and or lead 1 and AVL. So we have this lateral wall elevation and infarction. And here's where we're going to start to see reciprocal changes. So I see ST segment elevation in V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. We're going to loop back over to lead 1. Oh, and there's ST segment elevation there too. And in AVL, there's also ST segment elevation. So we got ST segment elevation like everywhere. But I've got these ST depression. That's our reciprocal changes, remember, because these are reciprocal to our lateral leads. So we've got ST segment depression in 2-3 AVF, ST segment elevation everywhere else, and I've got this anterior septal MI with lateral extension. What's one of these look like in practice? Well, start going through all the way down. Lead 1, I've got some ST segment elevation. ST segment is above baseline, right? Lead 2, ST segment depression. ST segment is below baseline. Lead 3, ST segment depression. We're going to skip over AVR for now. AVL, ST segment elevation, above baseline. AVF, ST segment depression, below baseline. V1, elevation. V2, elevation. A little bit, right? Look at that. There's a little bit of elevation. V3, elevation. V4, just a little bit of elevation. Just like a tiny bit, but it still meets our criteria. V5, V6, not seeing any elevation there. But what are our regions of elevation? Well, 1, lateral. AVL, lateral. V1, septal. V2, septal. V3, anterior. V4, anterior. So I have an anterior septal MI, lateral, high lateral wall elevation extension because of that elevation, the ST segment elevation. And then I have reciprocal changes in my inferior leads. I have this ST segment depression in my inferior leads because of this lateral wall elevation. So remember that your lateral wall and your inferior wall are reciprocal to each other. So if you see elevation one, you're going to see depression in the other. All right, let's look at this second 12 lead, and oh my god. Okay, so we're going to go top to bottom. Lead one, baseline is all over the place, wandering baseline. We're going to skip over that a little bit. We're just gonna skip that. Lead two, definite ST segment depression. Lead three, definite ST segment depression. Skipping over AVR, AVL. I see ST segment elevations above baseline there. AVF, ST segment depression. V1, definite elevation. V2, definite elevation. There's a QRS complex. That's a QRS complex right there. This entire thing is this like ST elevated T wave. So ST elevation there. V3, yeah, we're not even gonna get into that one right now. That's a whole another bug right there. If we follow this down, so where is the QRS complex? Where is the T wave? Follow this down. Oh, there's the QRS complex, like right there. So ST segment elevation there, even though it looks like this weird thing. V4 elevated, V5 little elevated, a little bit. V6 maybe a little depression, a little normalish, right? So where do I have elevation? AVL, V1. AVL is lateral, high lateral. V1 septal, V2 septal. V3 anterior. V4 anterior. V5 lateral. So I've got again this example of an anterior lateral or anterior septal, anterior septal MI with lateral extension, and I've got these reciprocal changes here in 2-3 AVF, which are inferior leads, which are reciprocal to our lateral leads. Third AKG, another example of an anterior lateral septal, so anterior septal with lateral involvement, lateral extension. So lead one, elevated ST segment elevation. AVL, ST segment elevation, very obvious. So I've got lateral involvement here. V1 elevated, V2 elevated, V3 elevated, V4 nah, V5 nah, V6 nah, nope. But I've got lateral 1 in AVL. I've got septal V1, V2, V3. I've got anterior involvement. So I've got this anterior septal, lateral involvement, ST segment elevation. So I've got this anterior septal MI with lateral involvement because I also have these reciprocal changes 2-3 AVF. I've got ST segment depression, depression, and depression. Right, moving on from that, let's talk about lateral wall MIs. Just isolated lateral wall MIs might be V5, V6, might be lead 1 in AVL, might be a combination of the two. So we've got our lateral wall V5, V6. You'll see ST segment elevation there. Might see it in lead 1 in AVL. So is it a lower lateral wall? V5, V6 is a higher lateral wall 1 in AVL. Either way, we're going to see some reciprocal changes in 2-3 AVF. So we've got ST segment elevation over here. We're going to have ST segment depression in our inferior lead. Let's talk now about inferior wall MIs. These are commonly associated with the right ventricle because our inferior leads are 2-3 and AVF. But lead 3 and AVF, and a little bit with lead 2, but definitely 3 and AVF have these really good views of the right ventricle. So if you see ST segment elevation in 2-3 AVF, you have this inferior wall MI. We're going to be thinking right ventricular MI, and we're going to do this right-sided 12 lead. We're going to flip some leads over to the right side and double check. So we've got 2, 3, and AVF as our inferior leads, and we're going to have reciprocal changes in 1 and AVL. So if I see ST segment elevation here in 2, 3 AVF, I'm going to see ST segment depression in leads 1 and AVL. So again, inferior wall MIs, ST segment elevation 2, 3 AVF. And I'm probably going to see some ST segment depression in our reciprocal leads, lead 1 and AVL. Now inferior wall MIs, if they're in the left ventricle, are probably going to show up as inferior lateral MIs. So I've got elevation 2-3 AVF, but also maybe elevation in V5, V6, and or lead 1 or AVL, depending on how high up it goes. So in this example, I've got elevation in 2-3 AVF, I've got an inferior MI, I've got ST segment elevation in V5, V6, so I've got a lateral MI, and here I'm still going to see some reciprocal ST depression because these are the high lateral leads reciprocal to our inferior lead. So even though I have an inferior lateral MI, I'm still going to see a little bit of reciprocal ST depression.